All right, my name is Rich Schmidt. It's June 25th, 2015. I'm here at Linfield's Nicholson Library talking to Al MacDonald. And Al, our first question we always ask people doing oral history interviews is, why wine?
Why wine? Well, actually, it was probably more grapes than wine. I grew up in Michigan and moved out here in 1977. I graduated from Central Michigan University with a master's degree in psychology and worked in Florence running a sheltered workshop for physically handicapped, mentally handicapped individuals. However, I would say everyone's going to go to the coast this weekend because it's so hot here. But the problem with the coast is that it's always cool there. And so it wasn't quite the summers we were used to. So my wife and I decided that, that we didn't want to live on the coast anymore. So I applied for some jobs here in the Willamette Valley, and I didn't get them. But at that same time, her parents thought that maybe they grew up with a farming background, and I grew up in a farming community, that perhaps we could buy a farm in the Willamette Valley. As a place to raise our kids, essentially, which we didn't have any at the time, but we were planned ahead. So we bought a piece of, so we thought, well, what could we grow? And at that time, it was 1980s, 1980. Wine grapes were the up-and-coming new crop, if you will. There weren't very many planted, and not a lot of people knew what they were doing. So we contacted a company out of Salem that specialized in vineyard property. Mm-hmm. And they had this place for sale in Polk County, and it was 250 acres, and it had multiple uses. So it was also timber, and it was grain, but there was plenty of spots on the site that were suitable for grapes. We didn't know much about wine, other than that we liked to drink an occasional bottle for, if we'd spend $3 on it. That was an expensive bottle of wine. So we contracted with that group, and we developed our first planting in 1982, which was 16 acres of Chardonnay and 16 acres of Pinot Noir. The next year we added what we thought were 12 acres of Gewürztraminer. It turned out to be only 9, but that's when we found out the management company wasn't quite truthful, because they weren't measuring land, but they were charging by it. And there were 36 wineries in the state at that time. I don't know how many in the Willamette Valley, because there were some all over the state, and a few of those were fruit and berry wineries. Mm-hmm. So it was a matter of just contacting a few of the wineries to see if they would purchase grapes, and so we did that, and we sold our first crop in 1985, is when they first came into production. Because there weren't a lot of people that knew a lot about growing grapes in Oregon, and that I did have an academic background, I got involved with what was then called the Oregon Wine Advisory Board, and also the North Willamette Valley Wine Growers Association. And I got appointed to the research or technical committee, and we worked with the researchers at Oregon State. Mm-hmm. And from there, I learned a lot about grape growing, and got to visit a lot of different vineyards to see what people were doing. And we'll have to say we did make a lot of mistakes to begin with, but over the course of time, we learned quite a bit from our colleagues in the university. So,
was it a conscious decision not to make wine, just to purely grow the grapes and sell them?
Well, on the day we planted our 32 initial acres, we were the 4th largest vineyard in the state. Wow. And that was going to take all of our time. So it was a conscious effort not to get into the wine making part of it, just because that's another business altogether. And we needed to be successful on our farm 32 acres out of the 250 was not the entire farm, so we were still doing other farming practices.
And so the Eola-Amity Hills was purely good luck when it came to looking for land? Was there an inspiration to be there?
We did a little research. There were some pamphlets or publications put out, and we talked to a number of wineries on what they considered a good site. So there wasn't just luck. We did do some research on what we were looking for, soil types, sun exposure, you know, that type of thing. So.
And so once you were in the Amity, once you had this location, it turned out to be what you were hoping it would be?
Oh, absolutely. As a matter of fact, over the course of the years, it still is called Seven Springs Vineyard. It's one of the preeminent vineyards in the Willamette Valley. So I think I had a part of that, at least. I chose the site and planted the grapes and farmed them for 25 years.
Seems like pretty good ownership of it, yeah.
Right.
Can you tell us a little bit about your early relationships with other grape growers in the area?
Well, one of the original grape growers in the area was the Castiles at Bethel Heights, and they were very helpful. They had used they had bought their property from the same management company that we had used. And then I think in 1984 they started their winery. But prior to that, they were very helpful in telling us, you know, some of the things. Also, Myron Redford at Amity was helpful. And there were a number of people at the same time that we were, that were planting just like we were, because this management company would actually put in several vineyards at the same time, and we got to know those people also. So they were all newbies just like us, and the old timers only had 5 or 6 years experience, so there wasn't much there either. And that was one of the reasons for joining the at the time called the North Willamette Wine Growers Association, so we could meet more growers and see what they had to say.
Kind of all on the same learning curve at the same time?
Right, we were all on the same learning curve. There were very few farmers at that time actually growing grapes.
So you talked a little bit about it, but was there if you came into the process not really knowing anything about growing grapes, how was that, the learning process from not really knowing grapes to planting a vineyard?
Well, that's why we relied so much on the management company in the first couple of years. And then we bought every book that we could on grape growing, and you know, and studied the books and talked to the people, and you know, we're self-learners, so it wasn't like we're just sitting there guessing all the time. We did have some inspiration from other countries and whatnot.
Sure. At what point did you feel like you had a grasp on it?
Oh, it took about 10 years before we really figured out the best way to farm that particular piece of property and the varieties that we were growing there. And some of it was market forces. Let's see. Our first grape sales, Chardonnay, which is the old clone that everybody took out, and now they're planting the new one, was our best seller. And behind that was Gewürztraminer, which was that 10-acre piece that we had. As a matter of fact, our first Pinot Noir that we sold was tied to the person buying. They wanted the Gewürztraminer, but we told them they had to buy the Pinot Noir also, and they paid us $400 a ton for it. That's when we figured out you really couldn't make money growing grapes unless you either raised the price or raised the yield. And we worked really hard on getting the price up over the years.
So you talked a little bit earlier, you talked about your master's degree in psychology. How has your academic experience kind of influenced your farming and grape growing?
Well, my academic experience, well, I don't know if the psychology part helped much, except maybe dealing with winemakers. But it just showed me that I had the ability to learn things, and I could learn from reading or going to classes. I took short courses. I took actually one of the first short courses that Chemeketa taught. Was another grape grower that was offering the course. You know, it was a non-credit, but it was a workshop type thing. And at that time, the Wine Growers Association had published a little pamphlet on growing grapes in Oregon, and so that was helpful. So, but it's always a learning process. And today I belong to the American Society of Enology and Viticulture, and they just have their annual meeting here in Portland. And so I've been involved, and I've gone all over the world as a representative of Oregon or of Live to different grape growing regions to see what they're doing. So I guess the academic part is that I knew I could learn and that books were probably a good place to start. How appropriate. We're in a library.
When you make those kind of trips now, do you feel like you have a lot to teach? Do you feel like you're still learning? Do you feel like some of both?
Well, both. You're always learning because there's always some new scientific evidence that comes out about the relationships between the environment and the plants. When dealing with things like climate change now, and how's that going to affect the different varieties that we have. Also, I have 35 years experience in actually growing the grapes. One of the nice things about owning your own vineyard, different probably from the academic side, is that you get to prune the same plant every year, and you can see how it responds to your manipulations. You can see you can do little different trials and treatments in your vineyard and see which is the best for your particular situation. So
you're talking about climate change. This is a question I was going to ask a little bit later, but as long as we're talking about it now, what do you see happening here in the Willamette Valley or in Oregon in general over the next 10 or 20 years?
Well, Dr. Greg Jones is probably the expert on that. What I see happening here is that bud break, bloom, and some of the phenological stages of the grapes are getting earlier and earlier than they have in the past. This year we had the earliest bloom that we've ever had. Some vineyards it happened at the end of May, first part of June. So if that trend continues, one thing about Pinot Noir is that it's extremely adaptable to a very narrow range of climatic conditions. And as it gets warmer out, we're going to have a different style if we continue to grow it in the same places that we are. That's one. The other is, I don't know, there's broader things that might be more catastrophic than what's it going to affect wine grapes.
Sure.
If there's no snow in the mountains and there's no water and we can't grow food, then what are you going to drink your wine with?
True. When you talk about Pinot, different styles, what exactly do you mean by that?
Well, Pinot Noir is grown in many places around the world, but it seems to do best where the climate is just marginal for it to get ripe. So what happens, and this happens in any grape variety, is that ripening isn't a singular event. There's a lot of things that happen in the berry that aren't concurrent. So like you need to have sugar to produce alcohol. You need to have flavor compounds, but they develop independently. So what can happen in a warm climate with a cool climate grape, like Pinot Noir, is that you can get sugars that are very high, which would translate to a high alcohol wine, and the flavors might not be there yet, or the acid might not be correct. So all of those things develop independently, which is one of the reasons that you select a variety for a particular climate, is to try and get those things to sync together, and that's when you're going to get your best product.
So then we'd be producing Pinot Noir that would just taste different, or would we phase Pinot Noir out entirely?
Well, I don't think we'll ever phase Pinot Noir out. It's the signature grape of Oregon.
Sure.
There are other varieties that might be promising, and there's some wineries that are working with that. They may plant Pinot Noir at different elevations to get the cooler temperatures. But it's hard to say. A vineyard is a long-term project. It's 30, 40, or 50 years of production. So what you plant now, you also have to think about what it's going to be 30 years from now. And that's really when they start coming into their peak. So I can't predict the future. I don't know what's going to happen with that. We'll have to wait and see. You'll be around, I probably won't. So.
We're always interested, especially with the grape growers, we're always interested in what they think about the kind of the future of Oregon wine with as temperatures go up.
Right. Well, it's not just temperature. It's going to be the availability of water. What if the rainfall patterns change? A number of the vineyards are not irrigated. Some are, but even if they are irrigated, are they going to have irrigation water? So, if you know, and on it goes. So it's not just a variety or a preference or something like that. We're talking about more serious problems.
Sure. Changing gears a little bit, you mentioned earlier Chemeketa.
Right.
How did you become involved with Chemeketa and your role in sort of developing the wine program?
Well, that's a good question. And that started in 1999. Let's see, I planted in 1980, so I'd been doing the vineyard for about 20 years. And we found out that as the vineyard got larger, it became more difficult for me to do all of the farming practices that I did before. So I started by hiring part-time help, the tractor drivers and whatnot. But if you wanted to keep a good person on, you really needed to give them full-time work. And when I gave them full-time work, that was work that I was doing, I had more free time to do other things. So I needed something to do. Also at that time in my life, I was going through a divorce. There were questions about whether the vineyard was going to be sold and whether I was going to get an income off it, and I needed a job. Chemeketa was advertising for a viticulture position, and I had experience in developing vineyards, good academic background, good aftermarket learning, if you will. And I'd also taught at a junior college before. I taught at Lane a couple of terms, a psychology course, but I had done some college teaching. So I interviewed for the position. It looked like a good fit. It was night classes. What they didn't tell me, well, they did tell me that they started with nothing. And they had this property in West Salem, and it was covered with trees, or scrubby trees, and they wanted to build a winery, develop a program, a curriculum. They had nothing. Essentially, they had me, the instructor, and they said, well, what does the industry need? Do it. Wow. So I had to figure out what classes we would teach, what the curriculum would be. You know, it's a 2-year course. How are we going to develop the Viticulture Center, which is now the Northwest Wine Studies Center? How are we going to design the winery? What grapes are we going to plant? How are we going to clear the land? So it was just given a blank slate, if you will.
That's pretty incredible.
Well, I was also farming my vineyard during the day, and at that same time I was also developing the live program. So we started that in 1997, so they all overlap. Yeah, I was pretty busy.
So how did you develop the curriculum?
Well, first thing we did was we went and toured similar programs. The only ones that were really available at that time were in California, Napa Valley, and then the one in Santa Rosa down there, their community college system. So I went down there, and I actually went to Napa and I bought all their textbooks. And of course, online you could get their curriculum and what it was. And we have an advisory committee for the program, so I knew all the members on the advisory committee, and also knew that from a practical standpoint, what is it that a person needs to know to be technically competent at growing grapes here in Oregon, and what scientific stuff do they need to know. So, so it was just my contacts, my knowledge of the people in the industry, and willingness to learn. I also went to Walla Walla. They had just started a program there. It's quite a bit different. And came up with a 2-year degree program in both, one in viticulture and one in, and a separate one in winemaking.
So who else was involved? Who was your advisory board?
Oh, boy, that's going to jog my memory now. Well, I know Terry Castile was on the was someone we leaned heavily on for winery design, and that because they just put one in a few years before. Lowell Ford, who is Eola-Amity Vineyards, and also was a dean at Chemeketa. But he started his own vineyard and winery. Who else? Just the extension people at Oregon State University. We had one statewide extension person at that time. Her name was Carmo. Anyway, and she had her training in Switzerland. We had Ed Hellman, who's now down in Texas. I just saw him the other day. Mark Chin was very helpful. So there were a number of people that I could at least talk to, but a lot of it was just my experience too, and looking at what we could do. I wasn't that familiar with the bureaucracy of the college system, if you will. So, but if you have a 2-year degree, you have to take an English class, you have to take a math, you know how it goes. So once we got all of the basic standards for a associate's degree, then we could plug in what was practical in the vineyard area. One of the things that we really wanted to do was we wanted students to have 1 full year's experience in the vineyard. So we set up the program that ideally now what they do is they start in the winter with pruning grapevines, and they're assigned a block of grapes. And they have to take care of those grapes all the way through to harvest. So wintertime they prune, spring they do the spring management, but it's on the same vines in the same block. And then they're responsible because in the fall they harvest them, and then they turn them over to the winemaking students who follow the process through another year making the wine. And then recently they've developed a marketing program, so after the winemaking students are done, they'll hand it over to the marketing students, hopefully, and sell it.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
So started off and you were the first, and I assume only at the start, instructor. Were there more instructors hired? How did the program expand?
Well, 2 ways. One, we relied on some adjunct instructors for, I couldn't teach all the courses, obviously, and I wouldn't have wanted to because that's not a very broad experience, I think, for students. So I taught the vineyard practices classes, the general viticulture, and we hired somebody to teach a soils class, adjunct. We taught someone to teach the wine appreciation classes. And then we had Barney Watson from Oregon State University retired. He was the longtime enology extension person at Oregon State. We convinced him to come up here to help set up our program and to teach the winemaking classes. He had told me that he wasn't interested in doing research anymore, but he really liked the teaching. And I had known him for years because I was on the research committee, and we had, as the Wine Growers Association and later the Oregon Wine Advisory Board, we funded their research. So, and I was the president of both of those, and not just the research chair. So I had interactions with those people, and we gave him money, so we got to know him. And so he was interested. He came up and he helped develop the wine side of the program. Prior to that, the best I could do was just place students in wineries kind of on an internship basis. And since I knew most of the wineries, I could select the type of students that would fit with the type of wineries, if you will, because some were more corporate than others, but it worked pretty well. But once we got our own winery, we could really do a lot more there on campus.
Yeah, so tell me about the kind of the beginning of the test vineyard and its expansion into what it is now.
Okay. Well, the test vineyard, it's not a test vineyard. We call it student vineyard.
Okay.
It started out with about an acre. Well, when we didn't know how much property we had until we cleared the ground. And then we had an engineering study come in to assess because they wanted to build a building, to assess suitable building sites. And they found out that most of the property was subject to seismic vibrations if we were to ever have a tremor. But there was one spot on the whole place that they could build a building that wouldn't roll down the hill if there was an earthquake tremor. But once we got it cleared, it appeared that there were about 8 acres that were plantable. But for the vineyard process, what I did was I laid out 8 different varieties in about a 1 acre block, and we made each block or each variety big enough that we could make 1 barrel, at least 1 barrel of wine. And the idea was that they were going to make wine at least on a commercial scale, and you need at least a barrel to do that. Because we didn't want to make wine in carboys or glass jars or anything that wasn't real. So we started out with that first acre and a half, and we got some vines donated from some of the local nurseries. And I planted several different varieties that I thought would be suitable for, because I wasn't just stuck on Pinot Noir. I thought, we can grow lots of things here. We should have different varieties just so people can have experience with it. So we planted Pinot Blanc, Viognier, Gamay Noir, Riesling, Pinot Gris, Chardonnay, Pinot Noir, several different clones of Pinot Noir. And that was the initial planting. And that's the ones that the students take care of nowadays. Over the years, because we had only an acre planted and there were 7 more, the school said, well, can't we plant the rest of it and then we'll just make wine and sell it and our program will get rich? And we goes, well, I don't think it really works that way. But so it was really more the administration that wanted to expand the vineyard. So we planted, at their request, we continued planting. We planted 4 more acres of Pinot Noir and 3 more acres of Pinot Gris, which were the 2 main varieties here in Oregon at the time. And those were what were considered our commercial block. And what we do now is we sell the grapes off. We don't make wine out of that. We actually just sell the grapes, and it breaks even. One of the things that was a problem is that it's really difficult to take care of 1 acre of grapes because the equipment that you need can actually take care of 8 acres. And then who was going to actually do the spraying? You know, there's a liability issue with students handling pesticides and applying them, and then there are certain operations that you really need a crew to come in and do that students 2 hours once a week, it's just not going to get it done. So what that enabled the school to do is at least they had enough acreage and enough grape sales that they could actually hire a vineyard manager to do some of the tasks that were more timely or needed licenses or that type of thing. So that's worked out very well. And then the current one doesn't do much in the student block. He does do the pesticide sprays because there's really no way a student, I mean, I suppose they could, but they'd have to get a license, and sure. It's a public property, and it gets very complicated.
So how many students were part of the program when you started? How many students did you have in the original?
My first class, which was, again, I didn't know a lot about community colleges at that point, was a general viticulture class in the fall of 1999. And I walked in and there were 60 students sitting in the chairs. And I went, what? Well, I didn't know that the administration would just kept bumping the numbers up. You know, class size is supposed to be, 20 or 30, and then when it got close, they'd just bump it up again, and they'd bump it up again. And so I walked in and there were 60 people in there, and I thought, well, and I had prepared a little lecture, and it was a 3-hour class, and I think 45 minutes into it, I was done. So I goes, well, this isn't going to work. Well, this is just my first day, so it's just kind of funny. So I says, well, let's all just introduce ourselves. There's 60 people. I give them 2 minutes. I'll kill, 2 hours. And that's what we did the first day, and actually they got to know each other, and it was kind of a nice experience, but it was just kind of like, well, I'm going to have to do more on lectures. But this was before before PowerPoint and all that stuff. So you came in with your little overheads, you know, that were all printed out there. And once you went through the stack, you couldn't, like, okay, now let's Google this or Google that. So you're just kind of stuck there. And of course, nobody had read any of the assignment the first day of class, so it wasn't like we could talk about the readings or anything. So, anyways, so after that, the practices classes were pretty much limited to 25 students. And that's more of a practical matter if you've got 25 people running around 8 acres. Of course, I was younger then, but it took me almost the whole 2 hours to get to each one of them at least once, just to find them out in the vineyard. You know, even though I knew where they were assigned and all that stuff, there'd be some down at the end of the row, some at the top of the row, and you know, just all over the place. So that was, we had to limit the size of those classes. The other ones are like the wine appreciation classes. You can get 25 tastes out of a bottle of wine, so that's the limit. And so if you want 2 bottles of wine, you have to let 50 people, but that's too many people for an instructor to do. So 25 in a class seemed pretty good, and we offered the same, so that would have been their second year class, but we offered them every year so that you always had a first year and a second year going into it.
Seems like there would have been a lot of people interested in teaching a wine appreciation class. How did you track someone down? Well,
we had 2 people. We just, we advertised. We found one person, Bob Sogi out of Eugene, who actually had done a lot of, he was into photography. He had taught wine teaching classes in Eugene, and he had a very extensive wine cellar. He just retired a couple years ago, and he was very interested in doing this. Another one, Patrick McElcott, who ran the Amity wine tasting room over there in Sheridan for years, also applied. And I think after we interviewed them both, I says, well, let's have one of them teach one class and one teach the other, because it gives a little more diversity for the students too, to have that type of thing.
So you mentioned earlier that part of the creation of the curriculum was trying to impart to all the students sort of a basic knowledge of what the basics they would need.
Right.
What were those basics as you've felt them?
Well, and as I still see it, it's evaluating your site. A lot of people that took the class already had land that they owned. So it's a matter of saying, well, you have this land, you didn't look for the best vineyard site. Let's take a look at how are you going to evaluate what you can grow here, what rootstocks you should use, what spacing. And so part of it was, just starting from that, was going, well, what do you need to evaluate the site that you have? What's your end goal? I mean, are you going to have a winery? Are you going to sell your grapes? And there are very, and then doing a realistic assessment of the quality of the grapes that might come out there. Now there's all kinds of wineries in the state. Not everybody sells a $100 bottle of Pinot Noir. Some people, have an average one, and grapes are suitable for different levels of that fit into different price points. So it's just where you sit in and what you want out of your vineyard. Then there's the practical stuff after that is how do you plant it? It's 2 to 3 years after you plant before you get your first crop. The grapes don't reach their peak till they're between 7 and 15 years old. So you still have this juvenile period. What are some of the diseases and pests that you're going to have to deal with? What's the best way to do that, given your location? So it's a lot of the practical stuff too.
Did you find that a lot of students were, so not necessarily unprepared, but maybe not quite, that you were giving them news they weren't expecting in terms of how long until they could have wine, how long until they could make money?
Oh, yeah. That's a good question. We saved also, because I ran my own business, I knew all that. So I saved that for the very last class. And we actually have a agribusiness management, which originally was a vineyard business management, and then there was one that was winery business management. We kind of combined those, where they have to do a business plan before they finish. That's kind of their capstone course. But they had to do a budget in my fall class, because after we harvested, we still had to go till December, and then they could figure out, how many pounds of grapes did they get, how much did we sell them for. They could go back over the whole year, figure out what the labor costs were, spraying costs, and then they had to prepare a budget for the next year. And I think that was pretty eye-opening for a lot of people.
Did you have a lot of people who changed their mind, decided not to get into the industry?
I've had some, yeah. They said, I should have taken this class first. I said, well, then you wouldn't have come to any of the other ones. But there were a few that said, well, maybe there's some other way I can get into the business. I also had people take the classes that not only were interested in growing grapes, but were interested in part of the service industry. So I had real estate people take the classes. I've had insurance people. I've had equipment suppliers and vineyard development people. What we've seen change although we still get a large number of people who are interested in planting grapes on their own property, is that things have changed here in the Oregon wine industry, and that we have more out-of-state owners, and so we have more vineyard management and development companies than we used to, and they need to hire trained employees. So what you're seeing more of now than in the past are people who are interested in getting jobs with the vineyard management companies, not necessarily with the wineries or the vineyards.
Interesting. Do you have any other, you kind of mentioned your first day of class, do you have any other memorable classroom stories that you remember?
Oh.
Or vineyard stories, I suppose?
Yes, I'll have to come prepared thinking about that, but I probably do. It might come back to me.
Okay, we're going to kind of shift then from Chemeketa into live. You mentioned live earlier.
Right.
And it was there any correlation between starting live and Chemeketa? Was it just purely that happened to be at the same time? Was there any reason they were interrelated for you?
No. Live actually started 2 years before I started Chemeketa. There was a group of local grape growers, Ted Castile, Di Crisp, Dick Daniel, and Mark Chin, that met. It was really an idea that, I'll have to go back a little bit more. This extension agent that we had, that I mentioned previously, this Carmo, had actually studied in Switzerland under a person by the name of Ernst Bohler. And Switzerland had a sustainability program. It's a little bit different than ours, but it listed details of what it would be, what you needed to do in a vineyard to become certified sustainable. In Switzerland, if you became certified sustainable, you got a government subsidy. They hear that's, that's just not American. Anyway, so he came over and gave a talk. And I'm not going to speak for Ted on whether he took that idea or whether he had it beforehand, but they had a list of standards. And we were meeting, and Ted used that list, and he also used a list from Dave Jordan, who was in New Zealand at the time. And they were starting a sustainability program there in New Zealand. Now, New Zealand's program, if they want to market their wine internationally, they have to be sustainable. So they have some big carrots on their sticks in Europe and other parts of the world that we didn't have here. But we wanted to see if we could do it. And I've always been interested in sustainability. I grew up in the late 60s, early 70s. Mother Earth News was my main reading thing. And we wanted to do things that were sustainable on the farm. One thing we found out with the timber on our property is, well, we had Dan Kemp from Salmon Safe come around, and he at that time was certifying vineyards as Salmon Safe. And when we started, we periodically logged, I had 150 acres of woodland. And in that woodland there was some old oak trees. But we found a forester that it was called individual tree management or something of that nature. Anyhow, he was certified as under the Rainforest Alliance as a sustainable logger. And so that was something we were interested in. He cut down the oak trees and sent them up to the barrel maker here, or up in Lafayette. And they were sustainable oak trees. And I says, well, why don't we have any sustainable wine to put in them, or grapes? We had Salmon Safe, but that wasn't quite close enough. I had to get back because I'm digressing and jumping around here a little bit, but that's fine. So we were meeting once a week, and Ted had come up with this list of 40 different practices that were sustainable. And we did it on a voluntary basis. We had somebody who just retired from Oregon State University who had done a lot of our grape research. His name was Porter Lombard. And one thing about the program from the very beginning was that we weren't going to be, as an organization, going out and doing and inspecting vineyards. We needed a neutral third-party person to do that. Otherwise, we'd just be inspecting our own properties.
Sure.
So he did it for free. We just paid his expenses, and he did it for 2 years. But at that time, we weren't a formal organization, and we knew we could do it. We had 36 people that were involved, and they paid their $50 in dues that year, and that helped pay for Porter's expenses. But the question was, well, where do we go from here? You know, we did it. It worked. Now what?
So this would have been like the mid-90s?
This would have been 97, 98.
Okay.
Yeah. So I wanted to know where do we go from here? So it occurred to me, at least at the time, that, well, they're doing it in Switzerland, they're doing it in New Zealand. Wouldn't it be good if Oregon could actually certify their vineyards through an international organization for sustainability? So Ernst belonged to this, Ernst Bowler belonged to this organization called the IOBC, which is the International Organization for Biological Control of Noxious Weeds and Pests. And it was originally founded through the United Nations, but that's the group that wrote standards for sustainable farming. And they had a section on grapes, of which the Swiss program was interested. And because the extension agent at the time had a connection with Switzerland, I asked her to contact, introduce me to Ernst so that we could see if the IOBC would endorse our organization and our standards. And they had this whole list of things that we had to do. We had to incorporate, we had to become a not-for-profit organization, we had to write standards, we had to have dues, we had to have third-party inspections. And so I thought, well, that's a good project for me to work on. Little did I know at the time. And then they said, and you have to do this for 2 years before we'll even think about endorsing you. So we'd already done it for 2 years. I said, well, can you take those 2 years and at least give us 1 year credit for that? I applied to the IRS for 501c3. That was not an easy process. They don't just hand those out to anybody. And I had to convince him, well, he didn't want to know why we weren't organic, and just on and on I went. But anyway, we do have an educational component, and that was what swung it for us. And the fact that we don't, that we have the independent third-party inspection, which means that we're not self-promoting, which is a different nonprofit type organization. But so we're completely tax deductible. So it was just all these little steps that you had to go through. I went and presented our program to the ILBC at their meeting in Portugal, and they seemed very impressed. Then I went and presented it again at their meeting in Greece a couple years later. They sent a couple of inspectors over to inspect our farms and then inspect our program, and it met all their criteria, so they gave us the endorsement. And they've endorsed us since 2000 or 2001. So we had the international endorsement, which I think was critical for our organization, to just say that this isn't something grape growers just thought up for themselves.
Sure.
There's some overriding body that's looking over our rules and regulations and say they make sense or they don't make sense, or that's too self-serving, or you're allowing too many chemicals. But there's just somebody looking over what we're doing. So since then, it's just sort of grown. The hard part about it is getting consumers interested in, the product, or getting wineries interested in promoting it. And that's what they've kind of been doing the last 4 or 5 years, where now they're certifying wineries for using sustainable practices, water management, energy use, waste stream, so it's gone beyond just the farming into the production part.
Was there an initial enthusiasm in the state? Did you have to?
There was. Those are always the complaints, and we didn't charge. I knew another thing in order to make it successful is that we couldn't charge people a lot. So I think our original dues were about $50, and then we raised them to $75, and now they're still not very expensive as far as sustainability or a certification agency goes. We got a grant from a couple of government agencies to help us through the first 2 years, but it's a self-supporting organization now. And the dues pay for the executive director, and then there's a certification manager, so there's only 2 full-time people. The rest is still volunteer. There's a volunteer board of directors, volunteer technical committee, volunteer stuff, and then the inspections are as a pay-as-you-go type of thing. So we found out that they really only need to be inspected once every 3 years. They're inspected the first 2 years, and then once every 3 years after that. They still have document submission requirements, and they can be randomly inspected at any time. So that you pay for the time of the inspector at the time you get it, which is very similar to the organic organization. And they may do it more frequently, but not the full-blown on-site inspection.
So in addition to the kind of Oregon ethos of low input, have you seen benefits? Have wineries seen benefits from being live certified?
From what I hear, they have, and that's a better question for the wineries. There are some wineries that have embraced it wholeheartedly, and it said it has open markets, if you will. If they go out of state, for instance, and you go to the big local movement now, and the free-range chickens and the no hormone beef, and then you serve a wine. Where's the wine that goes, the sustainable wine that goes with that? And they go, well, yeah, we'd like some if it's any good. And of course, it is good. And there's no reason sustainable practices wouldn't produce a good wine. Sure. Although we don't, as an organization, pass judgment on wine quality. There's people out there that do that. But there are people that just do care about the impact that their vineyards are having on the thing about sustainability. It doesn't just include the environmental component, which is huge and something we're very concerned about. But there's also a social and an economic component to it. We want the wineries to be a part of their community, to respect their employees. And so there's a human component there. And if you're not economically viable, you're never going to be sustainable. So sure. That fits into it, although we don't make environmental decisions based on short-term economics, but long-term. And so we're trying to get people to think long-term, like, yeah, well, I can spray this thing and it'll save me $10. And I say, yeah, but 10 years from now, that chemical's not going to be available because this pest will be resistant. So, how are you going to start thinking 30 years into the future? These are long-term crops instead of just what am I going to do this year? And I think that's changed the mind. The other thing that I wanted when this program started, that it would be open. That's just not going to be any secrets. So we did hire our first full-time instructor, or our first full-time director. I said, I want this all to be on the web and accessible to anyone. And he worked really hard with a website developer. And right now our program, if you want to know anything about it, you can go to our website and you can learn anything about it. At the same time, we wanted all of the members' information confidential. So if you're submitting, you're up for inspection, right? And you're submitting your stuff, the only ones that can see that are the inspectors. And then they're sworn to secrecy. because we didn't want somebody to apply and then fail and then be on our website because maybe it's just took another year or two for them to come around. So you can see the general stuff. You can see the list of criteria. It's all transparent. And we wanted that because the consumers and whoever, our critics, need to see what we allow and what don't allow and what the rules are. It's grown from the 40 questions to about 400 now, and it's got a little complicated. Some you only answer once, when you're planting, and but it evolves over time, and new regulations come out of the IOBC, so they have to keep up on that, and it gets broader and broader. But I think it's good. It at least. And we also wanted that if somebody didn't want to join for whatever reason, they could at least look up there and see what practices would be sustainable, and they could go ahead and do them without getting certified. So, what harm could that do?
Sure. I was curious if, after the success of Live, if other states have followed and have a similar program.
That's a very good question, and the answer to that is yes. We were the first state in the United States to have a certification program for vineyards in the United States. And I was the president of Live for several years. And we found out that there was a lot of interest from other states. So I went and I gave a presentation of our program to the New York State wine growers, Long Island and Finger Lakes, Virginia, California, Washington, Pennsylvania. I mean, every state in the union now has at least a winery. They don't all grow grapes. And they don't all make grape wine. But New York now, the Long Island people have started their own certification program. Michigan is interested in starting one. California has 2 or 3 certification programs. We predate them, but they had their own things going at that time. So there is interest in other states, and part of it's being driven by retailers. For instance, in New York, part of they grow a lot of wine grapes, but they also grow a lot of juice grapes. And so some of the grape growers have both types. But there were a number of large retailers that wanted to increase their sustainability products. One that starts with a W, you probably know, there's down the road here. Anyway, has increased their sustainability profile, and so they wanted all of their suppliers to subscribe to some type of sustainability program. So we see the pull coming not just from people wanting to do the right thing, which is how we started, more or less, to consumers demanding that type of thing. And that's really refreshing. I like that. So yeah, I think we'll see others. Live has expanded to Washington. We certify vineyards and wineries in Washington, and we just recently started in Idaho. They have a small industry there, and it's not practical for them to start their own program. We aren't an organization that's looking to be a nationwide or expanding, but if somebody comes and asks us for some help, and if it's feasible that we can do that, then we will. I think the Long Island people asked us if we could set up their program. They had the Genesis one started, but I said, it's too far away, we can't. We have one full-time director, I mean, how can we do that? So then I said, it's really better because you have local problems and local environmental conditions if you set it up yourself. The only difference is that third-party oversight, that who's overseeing their rules, and I made that pretty clear to them that they need somebody, whether it's the university, the Department of Agriculture, somebody to review their rules so that they don't look or appear to be self-serving. And of course, they could have just taken all of ours right off the website. If they wanted it, yeah.
That's what I was going to ask. Have you found most of them have modeled pretty closely?
Some have, and some vary it according to their local conditions. We have, ours no rain in the summer. They have a lot of rain, different disease problems, different labor situations. So, and they have to write things to be specific for that.
So you mentioned, while we were talking off camera there for a second, you're talking about kind of growing wine in the UK, and you've been around the world. You've seen wine in other places. Do you foresee certain places becoming the next wine hotspot?
Well, that's an interesting question. I see wine being developed in a lot of different places. Who would have ever thought Texas or Arizona or New Mexico? Yet they've selected varieties and they're making a very quality product. It usually starts out locally with a local following, just like it did here in Oregon. And then if there's some national thing, you know, national trends, at one time it was anything but Chardonnay for white, or everybody wanted a glass of Merlot at one time, and now who does? So, you know, those things come and go. But if you have a good quality product and a local following, I think you can pretty much develop a wine industry anywhere grapes are suitable to grow. The big fad now, of course, is beer. You know, there's a brewery on almost every corner, and it's partly is because it's not as hard to get into. I mean, you don't need to plant a vineyard to start a brewery. So we'll see. And we're seeing a resurgence in distilled spirits. You know, that's increasing. So I don't say that we're all becoming more alcohol conscious, if you will, but it's we like the finer things in life, and there's a wide variety of them out there. So next hotspot for grapes, I don't, you know, could be anywhere. Colorado's got a nice little following in an industry that's growing, so who knows? Might have a Colorado wine one of these days.
What about outside the country?
Outside the country is wine is well, in Europe, wine is more part of their heritage than it was here. They didn't have prohibition, we did. Places that'll have problems would be like Australia if we talk about climate change and the rainfall patterns change or the heat changes, it'll be more difficult to grow grapes there. Probably the biggest new hotspot is going to be China. There's a lot of people that live there. And they grow a lot of grapes, and they're moving up economically, and they like wine. And there's a couple of vineyards just outside of Shanghai when I was over there, and they were originally founded by the French, but they're Chinese wine. I mean, they have it. So, and they have a lot of land suitable for growing grapes. So maybe we'll find that on our store shelves someday. I don't know.
So it's come up during our talk that you were the president of multiple organizations within Oregon.
That's correct.
Was that something that you set out to do? Was it something sort of a necessity, or was it something that you were?
Well, it was something I was interested in. I always thought I was somewhat of a natural leader, if you will, but the first organization, the North Willamette Wine Growers Association, it was more or less who didn't show up to the meeting and they got elected on the board that day. But I also understood I wasn't going to be able to advance my business without knowing as much as I could about how it worked. And the only way to do that at that time was to get involved in these organizations. They're also a support group. I paid tax dollars to the wine board through my grape tax, and I wanted to have some say in how it was spent. So I got involved in the research committee. We were giving money to Oregon State.
So you've had roughly 35 years in the Oregon wine industry, and you've seen it grow from, like you said, a couple dozen wineries into 600 plus now, and 900,
right.
900 vineyards now. What has that been like? What has it been like to have a front row seat to that and be part of that growth?
Well, I would have never thought that was going to happen. My original idea was I was going to be a farmer, and grapes were my crop. Okay. I also grew wheat and oats, and I had timber, and it was a diversified farm. A couple cows and some goats, and it was a good life. But seeing the wine industry grow, I think one of the things that's kind of interesting, I don't know, is that seeing the price of the wines become more, the wines become more and more expensive and more top tier, and everybody says we're world class, and we're kind of forgetting that we're just a beverage to have with dinner. And you don't have to sit down and have a $100 bottle of wine and go ooh and ah over it. You can say, well, I'm just having a pork chop tonight, and I'd like to have a glass of wine with it. And what would be a good glass of wine to have? And it's not, I'm not going to spend $100 on it when I spend $5 on the pork chop. So we see more of that gets the press. I don't know if that's the reality, so that's been kind of surprising to see that. And so it's becoming economically much more difficult to succeed the way I did. I mean, you can't just go out and plant 5 acres of grapes and think you're going to make any money, or start a 2,000 case winery with 600 wineries out there. Oregon hasn't grown that much that we can sell it all out our back door. So we have to be in the national, international market if we're going to do that. The only good thing that we have going for us right now is that Pinot Noir production, although in Oregon is huge, it's just really a small sliver of overall varieties that people buy in the United States. So we're a big producer of a very smallly used commodity, which means we don't have to, if we can just convince, if we just doubled the number of Pinot Noir drinkers, there wouldn't be enough land in Oregon to plant grapes. But that's just because of the size of the scale. And I think we need to look ahead. Where do we want to be 10, 20, 30 years from now? Do we want out-of-state corporations to be in here running our wine industry? I mean, that's starting to happen. And dictating what our style or what our legislation or laws are going to be. So we're at a point now where we're not all small family-owned operations, no matter what the literature says. But we're going to be going more corporate, and that's just because of the economics of the situation and how we're going to deal with that as an industry.
Do you think we are approaching, will there be a point when we stop growing in terms of numbers of wineries and vineyards? Will that number keep going up?
Well, I've seen it cycle over the years. It seems like we have these 5-year cycles where it goes up and then it goes down a little and then it goes up again. We'll probably see more consolidation. We'll see bigger wineries buying up smaller brands and maybe keeping the brands. I mean, that's what happens when you grow like that. It's easier to buy a company than it is to start one. So I think it'll just be interesting to see what happens next. The price of land. I bought my land for under $3,000 an acre, prime vineyard land. You can't touch it for 100 times that now, which is how I made money in the wine industry. Was the appreciation on my land values. I never made money on the grapes the whole time I was growing them, even though I was getting paid some of the highest prices in the state. It's just so expensive to plant a vineyard and grow grapes that it's difficult to make money just on the grapes. So in wineries, it'll be interesting. Once they get into the national market, it just changes the whole dynamics of things. It's no longer the people that come to your tasting room. It's you have to be in this Dallas market, and if you run out of wine and then you're pulled from the list, you can't get back in again. So it's there's a lot of pressure to have a product in these distribution channels. But that's something more for the wineries to talk about. But I just do see that happening, and I have traveled to most of the wine growing regions of the world and most of the major wine growing regions in the United States, and it's the same thing. Do you want to be local or you want to be national? And Some people are just satisfied, have their farm stand. 1,000 cases, that's a lot. That's 3 cases a day you have to sell. But they, they have a party room, and that's what they want to do. That's fine. And but once you make, it's not linear. It's incremental jumps. You go from 1,000 cases to 5,000, then all of a sudden you've got a big problem. Then you find out it's probably better to go to 20,000, and then maybe it's better to go to 100,000. So it's just where you want to fit in.
Do you find that the wine industry attracts a certain kind of individual? A lot of people in the Oregon wine
right.
and outside.
Well, we're all a little wacko. I don't know if it attracts a certain. It's an it's an individual type thing. So it attracts the type of people that like to set up their own operations, if you will, entrepreneurs. At least originally, and they come in all sizes and shapes, So we all have different goals. Mine was to raise a family in the country, and it just so happened that I had other skills that could be used and to my advantage, and that's worked out good for my life. So other people have a dream of making the best Pinot Noir in the world. Well, there's only one. Otherwise, you're just as good as the best. So there's only one best, and that changes every year because the wine writers will tell you what that is that year. Hard to replace that number one. But you can make something so they do things like it's local, or it's the soil puts this flavor in it, or something like that. But so you see more people trying to get niches, if you will. Sure. So what segment can I hit? I got a vegan wine. I don't use any animal products in it. Or I have an organic, or I have a sustainable. So now you're seeing people target niches a little bit more. And there's still people that want to distribute in all 50 states and live in the chateau and fly their plane to, France once a year, or and then on weekends in the Caribbean or whatever. So, the old adage, and you probably heard this before from other people, is that if you want to make a little bit of money in the wine industry, start out with a huge fortune and plant a vineyard. So that's an old one. But, okay.
All right. Is there anything that I should have asked you about that you'd like to talk about?
Well, I think that's pretty much my whole life story right there. When we start when I was a kid or something. But, my first wine was Boone's Farm apple in college, because we could buy a case of it for $9. And I've grown accustomed to better wine since then.
Do you have a personal favorite?
No.
No? Even a personal favorite variety?
Well, my feeling on wine is that I consider it a beverage with meals. And so my wine choice is going to depend on what I'm eating and my social situation at the time. So, and I like all styles, and I like all varieties. I don't just drink Pinot Noir or Chardonnay. I like the wine that the group is producing from my vineyard now. I got the 2 highest scores ever. So, again, a good vineyard site. But I wouldn't drink it with my hamburger, and the one I did drink with my hamburger would be the best one I had that night. So I don't think there's any mystery or mystique about wine. It's a beverage, and it's a beverage that's meant to go with food. And if you separate those two, then you're kind of losing sight of what it's all about.
All right, well, that wraps it up for me then. Before we let you go, I have to congratulate you on your recent Wine Person of the Year award from Oregon Wine Press.
Well, thank you very much. It's nice to be honored by the industry, or recognized at least after all those years that I did all that volunteer work with. And I got some pretty nasty letters too when I was doing that. It's just like, it was my fault they did that. All right. So anyway, that was a very nice honor to have. So, and it's been a good career at Chemeketa. I think they have a strong program there, and they'll be training future wine growers and winemakers and marketers. That's our biggest need right now in the industry, and think I'm going to enjoy retirement. I'm still doing a little consulting with Live. I do some of their out-of-state inspections because I have the free time to go to Idaho, I guess. And still involved in some of the different organizations, but we'll see how long that goes. So.
Nice to have options.
It is. Right.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much.
You bet.